When a starving German shepherd collapsed behind a dumpster in the middle of a blizzard, no one expected what would happen next. A woman who had nothing left to give gave him a chance. A silent little girl who hadn't spoken in months whispered his name, and a forgotten dog with no future became the reason two broken souls came back to life. But the moment a man from Scout's past returned, everything they'd rebuilt was suddenly at risk. The snow came down in thick veils, painting the town of Blue Hollow in ghostly white. It was late January, the kind of bitter, wind-lashed winter where even the pine trees groaned beneath the weight of ice. Blue Hollow, nestled between low ridges in western Montana, was a quiet town. Fewer than 3,000 people, most of whom kept to themselves during the long, punishing months of cold. On the outskirts, where the town dissolved into barren hills and storage lots, a battered supermarket sat dimly lit, its dumpster steaming faintly in the sub-zero air. There, beneath the rusted lip of the dumpster, a shape moved. He was barely more than a skeleton covered in patchy fur. A young German shepherd, no more than a year old by the looseness of his joints and the uneven growth of his frame. His coat was once thick but now clung to him in sodden patches of gray and dull brown, like ash smeared across bones. One ear stood upright while the other flopped, the tip frostbitten and blackened. His ribs jutted out sharply and his hind legs trembled each time he shifted. But what was most haunting was his silence. No bark, no whimper. Just the dull rustling of paws scratching through trash bags, hoping for something edible. He found half a roll, stiff with mold and soaked through. He gnawed at it, teeth scraping on crust, but his strength was failing. Each chew was a battle against fatigue and cold. The rumble of a small truck pulling into the alley made his head jerk up. Hannah Monroe parked her white delivery truck beside the back lot, her breath fogging the inside of the windshield before she shut off the engine. She was 33, with a lean build, medium height, and strong shoulders from years of loading boxes. Her auburn hair was tied back in a messy ponytail that stuck out from under her knit beanie. Her eyes were a calm, steady hazel. Sharp from experience, but with a quiet sadness buried behind them, the kind that lingered long after heartbreak. 2 years ago, she had left a 10-year marriage with nothing but the clothes in her truck and a bank account so thin it couldn't afford hope. She had come to Blue Hollow looking for a place no one asked questions, somewhere she could deliver packages, pay bills, and keep to herself. She lived in a small prefab house on the edge of town, alone but unbothered by it. She stepped out now with a cardboard box tucked under one arm and a bag of trash in the other. As she approached the dumpster, the movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a raccoon, but as the snow swirled back and the shape lifted its head, her breath caught. "A dog," she whispered. The German shepherd didn't run. He only watched her with wide, amber eyes. There was no challenge in his gaze, just exhaustion. He lowered his head again as if even hope required too much energy. Hannah dropped the trash bag beside the dumpster. Without thinking, she stepped forward slowly, kneeling despite the freezing wet that soaked into her jeans. Her voice softened into something instinctive and careful, the way one speaks to broken things. "Hey, buddy, I'm not going to hurt you." The dog flinched but didn't move away. She could see the raw skin along his side now, the way his paws were cracked and bleeding, one back leg held at an odd angle. Her delivery shift didn't matter anymore. She shrugged off her heavy coat and laid it on the snow. Inch by inch, she coaxed him closer. It took 5 minutes, and the only sound was the wind howling through the alley like a wounded animal. When he finally stepped onto the coat and collapsed with a groan, Hannah reached out and touched his side. He was burning with fever. She hauled the box of supplies into the back of her truck, then returned and carefully wrapped him in the coat, lifting him into the passenger seat. His body was frighteningly light. Back inside the cab, she turned the heat up full and grabbed an emergency blanket from behind the seat. As she tucked it around him, he didn't resist. His breathing was shallow, eyes glassy. She glanced down at him and murmured, "You're not going back out there. Not tonight." She paused, watching the way his gray, ragged fur caught the dashboard light. "I'll call you Ash," she said softly. "That's what you look like something that burned, but maybe still warm underneath." The truck rolled back through the winding, icy roads of Blue Hollow, past frozen mailboxes and Christmas lights that hadn't been taken down. Hannah's house stood just outside the town's last stop sign, a squat, single-story structure with pale siding and a metal roof that howled in the wind. She carried Ash inside in her arms, laying him down on a pile of old towels near the heater. He curled in on himself, but did not sleep. His eyes stayed on her, not with trust, but with something quieter. Suspicion muted by exhaustion. Across the narrow yard, a porch light flickered on. Behind the window stood a small figure. Maggie. She was 9 years old, a slim child with light brown hair pulled into a side braid, her posture always a little too still, like someone afraid to breathe wrong. Her cheeks were pale, not from the cold, but from grief that hadn't lifted. Maggie lived next door with her grandmother, Mrs. Edna Keller, a retired librarian with kind eyes and stiff knees. The girl had stopped speaking after her mother passed from cancer 2 months ago. People said she might come around, or she might not. That night, she pressed her nose to the fogged glass and stared as Hannah moved through her kitchen, heating up broth and shredding chicken into small pieces. Ash didn't eat at first, but when Hannah dipped a finger into the broth and touched it to his nose, something sparked. He licked. Then slowly, weakly, he rose and began to lap at the bowl. Maggie's breath clouded the glass. Her eyes weren't wide with fear. They were filled with something else, like recognition. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, muffling the world into silence. Inside Hannah's home, beneath layers of towels and fire-warm air, Ash finished his first meal in what may have been weeks. He curled tightly, tail tucked under him, and for the first time since she found him, he slept. From her window, Maggie watched the dog's side rise and fall, over and over again. Her hand reached out and rested on the cold pane. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and in the quiet warmth of that snow-buried night, 3 lives, each broken in their own way, began to shift, ever so slightly, toward each other. The sun over Blue Hollow had barely risen, but it spilled enough pale light to turn the crusted snow into a mirror of the sky. The wind had quieted after last night's storm, leaving behind drifts that hugged porch railings and crunched beneath boots. Inside the small prefab house on the edge of town, Hannah Monroe stood at the kitchen counter, pouring warm water into a steel bowl filled with chicken broth and powdered supplements. The smell filled the cabin, modest but neat. Walls lined with faded maps, second-hand furniture softened by time, and a wood stove that popped quietly with heat. On the floor nearby, wrapped in a nest of old towels, Ash lay curled with his head down, body trembling with small, involuntary shudders. The young German shepherd had barely moved since she carried him in last night. Though his eyes opened now and then, they carried a faraway, dim glaze, as if he had stopped expecting anything from the world. Hannah placed the bowl beside him and sat down slowly. "Try again, buddy," she whispered, her voice rough from sleep and quiet emotion. Ash lifted his head but didn't move toward the food. After several minutes, she dipped a finger into the broth and held it under his nose. The scent stirred something. He sniffed, and after a long pause, flicked out his tongue. He licked her finger, then slowly inched toward the bowl. He didn't eat so much as lap mechanically, every swallow slow and weary. It wasn't much, but it was something. By midday, Hannah bundled Ash in a thick flannel blanket and gently lifted him into the back seat of her truck. She drove toward the southern edge of town, passing shuttered storefronts and the snow-dusted library. Just beyond the post office stood a squat, weather-worn building with peeling green paint and a wooden sign that read, Blue Hollow Animal Clinic. The windows were fogged, the porch light flickering. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and old linoleum filled the air. A tall, wiry man in his early 60s stood behind the reception desk, leafing through a clipboard. His name was Dr. Emmett Riley, known locally as Doc Riley. He was a man who had seen too many things to be surprised anymore. Deep lines around his steel blue eyes, short silver hair, a faint limp in his left leg from an old injury no one asked about. He wore a faded flannel shirt under his lab coat and moved with a quiet, deliberate manner. Hannah had met him only once before, when she helped rescue a litter of kittens from a drainpipe last summer. He hadn't spoken much, but there had been kindness in his silence. As she pushed open the door, he looked up. "You bringin' trouble or hope?" he asked dryly. "Maybe both," she replied, lifting Ash gently from the blanket. "Found him last night behind the Jasper's Mart dumpster." Doc Riley peered down, his brows lowering. "Damn, that's a skeleton with a heartbeat." He gestured to the back room, and they moved into the cramped examination space. Shelves were stacked with dated medical books, jars of cotton balls, and handwritten notes taped to the wall. There was a single steel table, which Riley patted with a thick towel before motioning for Hannah to lay the dog down. Ash didn't resist. His head slumped to the side, breathing shallow, but his eyes flickered open when Riley touched him. "Good boy," Riley muttered, running practiced fingers over the dog's legs, spine, and chest. "No broken bones, but he's got scabies and fungal lesions. See here?" He pointed at raw patches under Ash's front legs. Also an ulcer in the right eye. Likely early-stage keratitis. He paused, then lifted Ash's lip. The gums were pale. Severe anemia, malnourished, dehydrated. Likely hasn't had consistent food in weeks. Might be longer. Hannah stood stiffly, arms folded. "Can he make it?" Doc Riley leaned back, exhaled through his nose, and scratched his jaw. "If he doesn't have internal damage or infections we haven't caught, maybe. It's a steep hill. You willing to climb it?" She nodded. "He didn't give up in the snow. I'm not giving up now." Riley eyed her a moment longer, then nodded once. "All right, I'll put together topical cream for the lesions, antibiotic drops for the eye, and supplements. No vaccines yet. He's too weak. I want to see how he responds over the next few days." He handed her a list and began gathering bottles and small syringes from the shelf. "Anything else?" she asked. Doc hesitated. "Just be patient. He's not just hurt. He's been alone too long. The mind needs healing, too." Back at home, Hannah prepared a sleeping corner by the heater. Extra blankets, a small stuffed bear she found in the garage, and a space heater nearby. Ash slept, then woke, then slept again. His breathing was uneven but stronger by evening. That night, as the temperature dropped below zero, a small figure stepped silently across the snowy yard. Maggie. She wore a too-big parka, sleeves dragging over her mittens, and rubber boots that squeaked in the frost. Her braid peeked from under her hat. She carried something in her hands, a faded quilt with patches shaped like stars and acorns. She crept up to Hannah's porch and folded the quilt gently, placing it beside the door. Before turning away, she paused. Through the living room window, she could see Ash. Still curled, now twitching slightly in sleep, as if dreaming for the first time. Her breath misted on the glass. Her fingers pressed into the snow-dusted railing. Then she turned and disappeared into the darkness. Hannah found the quilt the next morning. She knew it wasn't from Mrs. Edna. She'd recognize that stitching anywhere. It was Maggie's. The girl hadn't spoken since her mother passed, hadn't made eye contact in months. But this, the folded quilt, was a voice all its own. Hannah didn't mention it aloud. She simply laid the quilt across Ash's bed and sat beside him, stroking his ears. Later that day, she found Maggie's notebook on the front step. The cover was blue with a doodled sun on it. Inside, in childish print, was a single drawing: a dog lying under a tree. Above it, in shaky pencil, were the words, "Don't leave this time." Snow still blanketed the ground in Blue Hollow, though the harsh winds had finally stilled, leaving behind a frozen quiet that seemed to soften the town's hard edges. The sun cast a weak golden hue over rooftops, and icicles glittered like glass teeth from eaves. Inside Hannah Monroe's small house, warmth radiated from the wood stove, mixing with the smell of boiling rice and shredded chicken. Steam curled gently from the pot on the stove, filling the kitchen with comfort, like a memory trying to become real. Ash lay on a folded quilt near the fire, the one Maggie had left behind, its faded patterns glowing in the morning light. He was awake now, head raised, amber eyes alert but still cautious. His fur was patchy but slightly cleaner, the raw patches along his sides slowly forming scabs under Hannah's careful hands. He hadn't barked or whimpered, but he followed Hannah with his gaze whenever she moved, ears twitching at the sound of her voice. She crouched beside him with a shallow ceramic bowl. In it was warm rice porridge mixed with poached chicken, fish oil, and vitamin powder. The moment the scent reached him, Ash leaned forward and sniffed. His tongue darted out tentatively and then, too quickly. He buried his muzzle in the bowl and began eating as if someone might snatch it away. The first few bites went down whole. He choked and coughed, stepping back, chest heaving. "Slow down, baby," Hannah murmured, wiping his mouth with a towel. Her voice cracked on the last word. Tears sprang to her eyes, not from fear, but from the ache of watching a creature so desperate for something so basic. She'd seen children on the streets of Seattle once when she was younger, eating from a shelter handout the same way. It had haunted her since. Ash looked up at her, head tilted, breath shaky. His tail moved, just a faint thump against the blanket. "That's the first wag," she whispered. "We're getting somewhere." As the days passed, a quiet rhythm took hold. Hannah worked her delivery job in the mornings and returned by noon, always with groceries and supplies tucked under one arm. Each day brought a small improvement. Ash's energy grew, his appetite stabilized, and his eyes, once dull and sunken, began to hold a certain light. His wounds dried and flaked. Doc Riley checked in by phone each evening. "Keep him clean, keep him fed," Doc said. "He's responding well. Still no vaccines, though. Let's wait till next week." Hannah kept a small notebook on the counter, recording everything. Temperature, meals, stool, energy level. She wasn't trained, but she treated him the way someone might tend to a dying plant with the hope it might bloom again. On the 5th day, as Hannah brushed a new layer of ointment across Ash's hind leg, a noise behind her caught her attention. It was soft, barely a shift in air. She turned. Standing by the open gate between her house and the neighbor's yard was Maggie. The girl was dressed in her usual parka, a knit hat pulled low, hands tucked into her sleeves. She didn't speak. Her boots crunched quietly on the icy path as she stepped forward, eyes fixed on Ash. Hannah didn't move. Maggie came to a slow stop beside the dog. Ash, sensing something unfamiliar, lifted his head. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He only stared, ears slightly back, unsure. Maggie knelt. Her gloved hand reached forward, paused in the air for a long, still second, and then gently touched Ash's side. Ash blinked once, then he lowered his head again, resting it on her boot. Hannah held her breath. Neither girl nor dog made a sound. The fire crackled. Time held its breath around them. Hannah rose quietly and went into the kitchen. She returned with a warm mug of cocoa, steam drifting upward like incense. Without a word, she set it on the porch rail beside Maggie, then sat on the steps, letting them have their space. Maggie stayed for almost an hour. She didn't drink the cocoa, but when she left behind a folded piece of paper on the wooden step. Hannah picked it up after dusk, opened it carefully. It was a letter. "Dear Mama, there's a dog here. His name is Ash. He looks like he came out of fire, but I think he's not afraid of me. He let me touch him. I think maybe he remembers what it's like to be held. I remember that, too. No signature. Just the shaky writing of a child trying to explain something too large for words. That night, Hannah tucked the letter into her own notebook, along with her daily updates on Ash's condition. The following morning brought another small miracle. As Hannah came in from the cold, stomping snow from her boots, she heard the thump of a tail against the floor. Ash was standing, wobbly, but standing, and watching her with ears perked. She crouched and called softly, "Come here, buddy." And for the first time, he did. Awkward, slow steps, one paw dragging slightly from nerve damage, but he crossed the space and pressed his head against her chest. She laughed, choked by surprise, and wrapped her arms around him. "Look at you," she whispered into his ear. "You're still in there, huh?" Later that day, Maggie returned, this time with a tin of peanut butter biscuits shaped like bones. She stood in the yard until Hannah noticed. Then, slowly, she walked forward and extended the tin. "Can he eat these?" she asked, her voice no louder than the wind. Hannah blinked, then smiled. "I think he'd like that very much." Maggie sat beside Ash again that afternoon, this time humming softly under her breath. Ash rested his head in her lap. In the kitchen, Hannah watched from the window, tears warming her face. She made 2 mugs of cocoa this time. Morning came with a hush in Blue Hollow, a fog laying thick across the valley like breath held too long. The snow, once powder soft, had hardened into thin crusts that cracked underfoot. The sun glimmered weakly above the ridge, touching only the tops of the pines. Inside Hannah Monroe's house it was warm and still. The fire in the stove had died down, but the thick air of healing lingered. Ash stood near the kitchen window, watching the outside world with a kind of wary fascination. He was walking more confidently now, though his gait still carried a slight hesitation in the back leg, and his coat, though patchy, was beginning to return with a brighter sheen. The scabs that had formed over the wounds were flaking off like old armor, and underneath, healthy pink skin showed signs of renewal. His eyes, once red and sunken, now gleamed a soft amber. On the porch steps sat Maggie. She was bundled in a navy parka with a red scarf wound twice around her neck, her braid tucked neatly under a knitted beanie. In her hands, she held a small sketch pad, the pages already curled from overuse. Her fingers were stained faintly with pencil lead and eraser smudges. Though she didn't speak often, she had taken to sitting by Ash nearly every afternoon, sketching in silence while he rested beside her. That morning, as the snow fell in fine flakes again, a green pickup truck crunched up the driveway. Out stepped Doc Riley, wrapped in his old Army-issue coat, his silver hair swept back under a wool cap. His weathered face carried its usual mixture of skepticism and gentle regard. He carried a brown medical bag and a thermos that smelled faintly of black coffee. Hannah greeted him with a quiet nod. "You're early. I wanted to see how our patient's doing before the roads ice up again," he said, stepping inside and glancing at Ash. Scout. No. Still Ash. Lifted his head and sniffed. He did not shy away. His ears perked forward, and for the first time he stepped toward the stranger without prompting. "Well, look at that," Doc murmured. "Tails up. Eyes bright. What have you been feeding him, Confidence?" "Mostly chicken and rice, and Maggie," Hannah replied, smiling. Doc knelt beside Ash and ran a slow hand over his back, checking for inflammation. "Coat's coming in, skin's healing. And that ulcer's nearly gone. He's still underweight, but I'd say he's turned a corner." He looked over at Maggie, who stood in the doorway, watching. "Kid," he said gently, "this dog's got a second chance. Maybe he needs a real name now." Maggie glanced at Ash, then stepped forward, one boot creaking on the floorboard. She whispered, "Scout." Doc tilted his head. "Why that?" "Because he keeps looking for something, but I think he's closer to it now." The name hung in the air like a breath of hope. Hannah said it aloud, softly. "Scout." The dog looked up. His ears twitched, and he wagged his tail once. "That settles it," Doc said. "Scout it is." The following days saw Scout grow steadier. His walks extended farther into the yard. He even barked one morning, once sharp and sudden when a squirrel crossed the fence. Hannah laughed, and Scout looked confused, then proud. Maggie added the bark into her sketchbook with little speech bubbles. "Yep." But peace in Blue Hollow didn't stay untouched for long. One Thursday morning, while Hannah was unloading groceries from her truck, a stranger approached her gate. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cut salt-and-pepper hair and a leather jacket stiff from wear. His name was Mark Kelton, and his presence carried the weight of something uninvited. His voice was cool, professional. "You the one with the German Shepherd?" he asked. Hannah tensed. "Who's asking?" "I work with Canine Tactical Response. Used to be a handler," he said, pulling a faded badge from his pocket. "We trained a lot of dogs before the agency shut down last fall. One of our pups went missing during transport. German Shepherd, male, 10 months, failed the sensitivity test." He pulled out a photo. The dog in the picture had the same floppy ear, the same deep amber eyes. Scout. "He yours now?" Mark asked. "He's not property," Hannah replied. "He's recovering from abuse. If he was with you before, it didn't go well." Mark's jaw tightened. "We don't beat animals. Some dogs just aren't cut out for the job. We cut our losses and move on." "Yeah, he remembers," she said, and closed the gate without another word. Inside, she called Doc Riley. Later that evening, Doc arrived with a file folder and a look of stormy calm. "I made a few calls," he said, dropping the folder on the table. Mark Kelton was listed as a handler, yes, but not a good one. Reprimanded twice for inappropriate methods. The center was shut down after whistleblower footage showed dogs being overworked, left crated for 18 hours. Hannah's hands curled into fists. Can he take Scout? No. Legally, the center was liquidated. Dogs without adoption records were declared unclaimed. Scout isn't registered to anyone. He's yours if you want him. Maggie had been listening from the stairwell. That night, she crept into the living room where Scout lay curled beside the fire. She wrapped her arms around him and for the first time whispered loud enough for Hannah to hear. "You're not going anywhere." In the morning, Hannah found a piece of paper taped to Scout's crate. It was another of Maggie's drawings. This time, it showed Scout sitting between two stick figures. One tall with curly hair, one small with a red scarf. A heart hovered above them. Scrawled in red crayon was a single sentence. "This is home now." The last frost of winter clung stubbornly to the edges of Blue Hollow, but the sky had begun to shift. It was no longer the flat gray of endless cold. Now, thin veins of blue cracked through the cloud cover, and meltwater ran in tiny streams along the roadsides. The pine trees dripped steadily, and the snowbanks receded with each warming hour. Spring had not fully arrived, but it was coming. You could feel it in the thawed ground, in the lighter wind, in the way birds had begun to test their voices again. In the front yard of Hannah Monroe's house, the grass peeked out in patches through the old snow. The porch had been swept, and a line of tiny boots rested neatly beside the door. Inside, Maggie sat at the kitchen table. A box of colored pencils spilled around her like a kaleidoscope. Her sketch pad lay open, and she was bent over it, tongue pressed gently to the corner of her lip in concentration. She looked different now. Not in a way that clothes could show, but in posture, in energy. She no longer flinched at sounds or shrank away when spoken to. Her red scarf was tied proudly today, not just for warmth, but for color. Her grandmother, Mrs. Edna Keller, a stocky woman with salt gray curls and an affinity for crossword puzzles, had been overheard on the phone recently saying, "She started humming again. The child is humming." Scout lay nearby, stretched out on the floor with his head resting over his front paws. His fur had grown back in full now, rich tan and sable, a subtle golden sheen under the morning light. The scar across his hind leg remained, but it no longer defined him. His eyes followed Maggie's every movement, calm and alert. Outside, a car pulled up the gravel drive. Hannah stepped onto the porch in a navy jacket and jeans, her hair tied back in its usual braid, and greeted the man who climbed out of a battered silver sedan. It was a sheriff's deputy, James Avery, mid-40s, tall with broad shoulders and a patient demeanor. His square jaw and sandy brown hair made him look younger than he was, though the lines around his mouth suggested a man used to listening more than speaking. James had known Hannah in passing for years, mostly through package drop-offs and town events. Now he brought a final piece of resolution. He handed her a small folder. States done with the Kelton matter. No ownership records, no claims filed. The dog's yours, legally and officially. Hannah exhaled with relief. Thank you. James glanced at the house, then down at the paw prints in the melting snow. Looks like he belongs here. He does. Back inside, Maggie waited with Scout's red scarf in her hands. She had washed it herself the night before, scrubbing it gently in the sink until the fibers softened. She held it out. Can we put this on him? Hannah nodded. Maggie knelt, and Scout stood still as she tied the scarf gently around his neck. When she was done, he nudged her hand with his nose. She smiled, wide and unguarded. It was the first time Hannah had seen her smile like that. It was like watching the thaw take hold of something frozen too long. Let's go, Hannah said. Time for a checkup. The truck ride was different this time. Scout didn't need help climbing into the front. He leapt in with ease, tail thumping excitedly. Maggie sat in the back seat, arms hugging her sketch pad, red cheeks bright from the wind. She leaned forward between the seats to talk softly to Scout as they drove. As the truck rolled through the town, people waved. At the corner bakery, Mrs. Tennyson, the elderly owner known for her lemon scones, raised her hand in a flour-dusted glove. At the post office, old Mr. Green tipped his cap. Scout looked out the window like he knew every face now belonged in his world. They pulled into the familiar parking lot of the Blue Hollow Animal Clinic. Doc Riley waited on the porch, sipping from his eternal thermos of black coffee. He gave Scout an approving once-over as they climbed the steps. Well, if it isn't the soldier come home. Inside, Scout was weighed, inspected, and, finally, vaccinated. Riley noted his healthy coat, solid heartbeat, and excellent eye recovery. The scar on his hind leg would always be there, but it no longer hindered his movement. He's more than stable, Doc said. He's whole. As they left, Maggie handed him a small drawing. Scout curled up under a starry sky. For you, she said simply. Doc folded it into his coat pocket with care. You're both doing just fine. That evening, after dinner, Hannah opened her laptop. Among the unopened emails was one from a local rescue organization she'd donated to in the past. They had seen her photos and posts about Scout's recovery and asked if she'd consider being a community liaison, helping match abandoned dogs with homes. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then clicked Reply. Yes, I'd love to. In her room upstairs, Maggie added the final details to her drawing for the Me and My Pet art contest. She drew herself with Scout, standing in front of a wide blue sky, a small house in the background with smoke curling from the chimney. She added Doc Riley on the porch and Hannah standing behind them all, holding a leash that wasn't needed. At the bottom, in big letters, she wrote, "The day I got my voice back." The next morning, Doc Riley stood outside his clinic, arms crossed as the sun broke through the clouds. From across the street, he saw Hannah's truck drive by, Scout's head sticking out the window, ears flapping in the breeze. Behind the wheel, Hannah laughed as Maggie sang along to a song on the radio. Doc smiled and whispered to no one in particular. That boy finally found his name. Sometimes healing begins in the quietest of moments. A child placing a blanket by the door, a woman choosing to stay, a broken dog daring to trust again. In a world that often rushes past pain, it is still the small, ordinary acts of kindness that can rescue a life. Scout didn't just find a home. He helped a little girl find her voice and a woman rediscover her purpose. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. We don't need to do something grand to matter. We just need to show up, stay gentle, and believe that even the most wounded hearts can learn to beat again. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Thank you for being here. In the dead of a Montana winter, a lone mountain lion cub appeared at a man's cabin, shivering, silent, and begging for help. What followed wasn't a fight for survival, but a quiet rescue that would blur the line between man and wild. Why did this cub choose him, a reclusive stranger haunted by his past? And what happened when he followed the tiny creature into the storm will stay with you long after the snow melts. Winter gripped the Bitterroot Mountains in its final, most unforgiving days. The air in Montana's high country was thin and dry, scraped clean by constant winds that howled through the jagged spruce like wolves in mourning. Snow fell in fine, endless sheets. So light it seemed to hover mid-air, only to be blown sideways, coating every tree branch, rock ledge, and animal track in the forest. The nearest town, Darby, lay a 2-hour drive to the south, its streets mostly empty this time of year. Up here, nature ruled, and she was neither kind nor cruel, only constant. Among the folds of that frozen wilderness, a female mountain lion named Sage moved with a grace forged by necessity. She was a powerful creature, muscular yet lithe, her fur a sleek, tawny gold streaked with darker ripples down her back. Her eyes, pale green and sharply intelligent, scanned the terrain with every silent step. Her body bore a faint scar across the left flank, the legacy of a deer's final kick many winters ago. But that injury had healed, and so had she. Sage was 8 years old, nearing the elder side of a puma's life, and the harsh winter made survival harder each year. Yet she was not alone. Bounding a few paces behind her, half-hopping through drifts nearly taller than his short legs, came Ember, her only surviving cub of a litter of 3. Just 5 months old, Ember was a pale mirror of his mother, his coat not yet fully darkened, still soft and plush like the undercoat of a snowshoe hare. His ears were large, overly alert, and his tail wagged clumsily every time he lost balance on the snow-packed slope. He had his mother's fierce eyes, but none of her calm. Every gust of wind startled him, every movement in the woods caught his breath. But beneath that jittery surface lived a bright and determined spirit, hungry to learn, desperate to follow every twitch and crouch his mother made. Their trek led them through a narrow ridge path overlooking the frozen creek below. The trail, now barely discernible beneath fresh snowfall, twisted around pines and sharp boulders. Sage paused often, testing the air, listening. Prey was scarce. The mule deer had moved lower in search of food, and even the squirrels had vanished deeper into the trees. Her ribs, though hidden beneath thick winter fur, were more visible than she liked. She had not eaten in 2 days. Still, her movements remained patient and deliberate. Ember mimicked each stop, crouch, and pivot, though not always in the right direction. Once, when a rabbit bolted from under a log, he leapt too early and landed face first in the snow. Sage did not scold. She simply looked back with tired eyes and kept walking. Far to the south, at the boundary between wilderness and human concern, another story stirred into motion. Dr. Leona Grant was adjusting the final camera trap along a wildlife corridor north of Hamilton. At 34, Leona had long outgrown the label rising star in wildlife biology and was now considered one of Montana's sharpest field minds. She stood at 5'7", lean and long-limbed, with an efficient posture and a face more angular than soft. Clear skin, storm-gray eyes, and shoulder-length black hair usually tied back beneath her wool beanie. Her voice was calm, direct, shaped by a decade of working in field camps where panic could mean death. She wore 2 scars, one down her left wrist from a barbed wire fence, the other inside. An ache from failing to save a bobcat caught in illegal snares 2 winters ago. Leona had been following a troubling pattern for weeks. 3 collared bobcats had gone silent in the past month, all within a 10-mile radius. Though predation was always a possibility, the caller's last signals hinted at sudden immobility, likely in traps. Her breath steamed as she knelt by the camera box, checking its angle. Behind her, her field assistant, Trevor, a stocky man in his late 20s, new to this terrain, stood sipping lukewarm coffee from a battered thermos. "You really think it's traps?" he asked. Leona didn't look up. "Yes, and not amateur ones. These animals aren't wandering far. Their paths are regular. Someone knows where to set snares that hit them clean and silent." She tapped the camera's memory card free, slid in a fresh one, then she scanned the tree line. Uneasy. "We'll set the motion sensor grid tonight," she said, "and I want acoustic monitoring activated by dusk. If they're screaming, I want to hear it." Trevor hesitated. "That's intense." Leona met his eyes. So are next snares. By the time she and her team headed back to the Forest Service road, a faint noise was echoing off the stone cliffs miles away. Too distant to reach human ears just yet, but unmistakable to those attuned to the mountains. The sound of puma paws slipping through powder. The sound of hunger pacing. As twilight dimmed the forest into a wash of indigo and silver, Sage and Ember reached a clearing she knew from seasons past. A wind-carved hollow beneath a fallen cedar offered some shelter from the elements. Ember curled into her belly and she draped a protective paw over his spine. Snowflakes fell into his fur like stars. His breath was fast but steady, heart full from the day's lessons. Sage stayed alert long into the night, her ears twitching, her eyes always open. The trail ahead would only grow harder, but for now, they were together and alive. Snow had thickened through the night, falling now in wide, wet flakes that muffled sound and blurred all edges of the forest. Dawn did not break so much as bleed slowly into gray, revealing a world whitewashed and deathly still. The Bitterroot Mountains felt like a place suspended outside of time, where every breath of wind carried the weight of centuries and every silence threatened to shatter something sacred. Sage moved cautiously, her paw prints vanishing behind her even as they were made. Hunger gnawed at her ribs. The wind was picking up again, making the high trees groan and sway. Ember trotted just behind her, legs stiff with cold, his pink tongue flicking across a nose dusted with snow. His coat, still too soft for real winter, clung wetly to his thin frame. Despite the hardship, his eyes flicked from branch to branch, absorbing every motion like a sponge. The lessons of the wild were sinking in, step by careful step. They were descending into a narrow draw Sage had not visited since the previous winter. It was lower in elevation, surrounded by young birch and deadfall, and usually a corridor for prey passing between ridgelines. But now the land was too quiet. No scent trails, no fresh scat, only the sharp metallic sting of something out of place. Sage paused, sniffing the air. Something wasn't right. She turned back to nudge Ember gently with her snout, a silent command to stay close. But the message came too late. There was a snap, a violent metallic crack that echoed like gunfire against the trees. The silence shattered. Snow fell from low branches as birds burst into startled flight. Ember leapt back with a startled cry. Sage's body contorted with panic. She had stepped into something hidden beneath the snow, something vicious. A steel snare, anchored to a buried stake, clamped around her neck with monstrous force. The cable bit into her fur and flesh, yanking her backward with a choking snap. Her legs kicked against the snow, sending plumes flying. She roared in pain, but the roar was cut short into a gurgled rasp. Her massive body thrashed wildly, twisting against the wire. blood darkened the snow in slow, spreading pools. The more she struggled, the tighter it drew. Ember froze at first, eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. Then, instinct flaring, he ran to her side, pawing desperately at the cable, his small teeth snapping uselessly at steel. His mother's eyes met his, full of agony and panic, but also something steady, something ancient. Protection, the last thing she would give. Ember yowled, he cried. He paced circles, tripping in the snow, bumping into branches. He could not understand why she did not get up, why she no longer led. Her legs moved weakly, her head dropped lower, and still the snow kept falling. Then, somewhere in his frantic mind, memory stirred. A scent. Smoke and cedar. A taste. Frozen venison on a rock. A shape. Tall and slow-moving, with eyes not like prey but not like predators either. The man. The quiet one. The one who had left food in the starving months when Sage could not hunt. Ember backed away from his mother, whining low in his throat. His tiny heart pounded. He looked at her once more. Then he turned and ran. Through the trees, through the waist-deep snowbanks, around stumps and boulders he pushed forward. The trail to the human shelter was vague in memory and covered now, but Ember had scent. He had desperation, and he had purpose. Miles away, at the edge of a frozen service road, Dr. Leona Grant adjusted her parabolic microphone under the shelter of a pine lean-to. Trevor stood nearby, arms crossed, his thick jacket dusted with frost. Leona's gray eyes were focused, narrowed against the wind. Her equipment picked up everything, from the rustling of voles beneath snow to the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. But this time, it was something else. At 0738, a sudden high-pitched screech pierced the feed. Not bird, not human. Leona stiffened. "Rewind, boost it," she ordered. Trevor complied, and the screech played again. Longer this time. It rose sharply and broke into choking distortion. "That's a puma," Leona said under her breath. "Pain, vocalization?" Trevor asked. She nodded grimly. "Caught in something. Snare or clamp. Could be a leg, but sounds choked. Could be higher. Neck, maybe." Trevor blinked. "That's lethal." Leona didn't answer. She was already moving, snapping the laptop shut and stuffing it into her gear bag. "I want a drone over that draw in 15 minutes, she said. "Send location marker to the ranger post. Tell them this is live." "You think someone set a trap up there?" Leona paused, her voice low. "I know someone did, and I intend to catch them." Back in the forest, Ember's journey continued. He crossed a partially frozen stream, slipping once on a patch of thin ice. He scrambled up a ridge and paused, panting, ears twitching at every gust. Twice he stopped, unsure, circling a stump before the scent of wood smoke pulled him forward again. Eventually, just past noon, the trees began to thin. The old cabin appeared like a ghost from the snow. Wooden slats stained dark with age, smoke curling from the chimney. It stood at the base of a rocky outcrop, surrounded by snowdrifts and silence. Inside, Tom Rivers had just finished chopping firewood. At 57, his frame was still strong but worn. He stood just under 6 feet, his shoulders broad, posture slightly bent from years of carrying packs and forest gear. His skin was weathered from wind, his hair mostly gray, swept back and tucked under a wool cap. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes a faded blue, the kind that seemed always halfway between remembering and regretting. Tom lived alone ever since his wife, Marjorie, had passed 5 winters ago. She died of pneumonia after a late-season storm trapped them without aid. Since then, Tom had rarely spoken more than a few words to anyone, save the occasional ranger passing through. But he watched the animals. He recorded their paths. And sometimes he left food, just enough to keep the balance. A thump startled him, then a scratching. Tom turned toward the door. He opened it slowly, squinting into the storm. There, half buried in snow, stood Ember, his tiny chest heaving, legs trembling, eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. The snow had deepened since morning, falling thicker now, no longer the gentle hush of early winter, but the punishing weight of late-season storms. Evening was beginning to bleed across the horizon, washing the forest in violet shadow. From the doorway of his cabin, Tom Rivers stared at the tiny creature before him. Ember, the young puma, half submerged in snow, his eyes wide and desperate, fur soaked and clinging to his fragile body. Tom blinked twice, his hands, worn from years of chopping wood and laying traps, not for killing, but for study, trembled slightly. He had always respected the creatures of these mountains, but he had never been summoned by one. The little cat scratched again at the doorframe, letting out a faint, rasping cry that barely rose above the wind. It was not aggression, it was pleading. Tom looked down at the young puma, then behind him, at the gathering storm curling through the pines. Something was wrong. He stepped back into the cabin and returned quickly with his canvas field pack, already stocked with bandages, a pair of rusted bolt cutters, a headlamp, and a thermos of hot broth. He pulled on his thick parka, an old forest green coat lined with moleskin, and his weathered gloves. Around his neck he slung a kerosene lantern, its flame flickering orange behind glass. "Let's go, little one," he muttered. Ember turned immediately, sprinting toward the trees. Tom followed without hesitation. Meanwhile, a half-day's hike north, Dr. Leona Grant knelt beside a fresh patch of disturbed snow. Her gloved hand brushed aside the powdery surface to reveal a partial paw print. Feline, wide, heavy. Beside it, boot prints. She narrowed her eyes, the gray sharpening like ice under pressure. She had seen hundreds of wildlife paths. This one didn't match the typical backcountry traffic. Someone had walked alongside an animal. "Trevor," she called. Her assistant jogged over, breath steaming in the dusk. "Found something?" Leona nodded. "Look here. Mountain lion, juvenile. And this..." She pointed to the boot track. "Is fresh. Too fresh for someone just passing through. See how the edge hasn't crusted yet?" Trevor scratched his head. "That means what, exactly?" "It means we're not alone out here," she said. "And someone's either very brave or very stupid." She scanned the tree line, her instincts tightening. "Grab the drone gear. I want aerial footage before we lose light, and mark this on GPS. If there's a trapper interfering, or a local trying to play hero, we need to know." Back in the forest's southern reaches, Tom followed Ember through the deepening snow. The cub moved fast for something so young, driven by fear and instinct. Tom's knees ached with every step, and he had to pause twice to catch his breath. At 57, he was still strong, but years of solitude had softened the edge of his endurance. The deeper they went, the more the trees seemed to lean in, like sentinels watching their strange passage. Tom noticed scuff marks on the bark, signs of panic. Blood sprayed onto an exposed root. His heart sank. He knew what waited ahead. After an hour, the snow finally began to level into a clearing. Tom raised his lantern. There, tangled in the roots of a downed pine and half hidden beneath a snowdrift, was Sage. The adult puma lay collapsed on her side, the steel cable of a snare cinched around her neck. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one pulling against the loop. Blood matted the fur beneath her chin, and her massive forepaws twitched involuntarily. She looked up as Tom approached, her pupils dilated, jaw slack with exhaustion. But she did not move to attack. Her gaze was wary, but no longer wild. "Easy, girl," Tom said softly, lowering himself to one knee. He saw how the cable wrapped under her fur, cruelly tight. The snare had been anchored to a nearby tree stump with a chain and crude spike, the kind he hadn't seen in years. Illegal, designed for maximum damage. Someone had set this recently. Tom unhooked his bolt cutters, inspecting the angle. Ember crouched nearby, tail flicking, growling softly. Not at Tom, but at the snare. "It's all right, son," Tom murmured, voice low and steady. "We'll get her free." He reached slowly toward the wire, letting the puma smell his scent. Sage closed her eyes briefly, as if resigning herself. With one quick motion, Tom clamped the cutters onto the cable's neck loop and pressed down. It took all his strength, but the wire gave way with a sharp, brittle snap. The snare uncoiled like a dead thing and dropped onto the snow. Sage slumped forward, choking once, then collapsing fully. Tom's hands moved quickly, pressing bandages to the wound, checking her breath, trying not to cause more pain. Ember circled protectively, licking his mother's flank as she groaned faintly. Tom tore strips from his emergency thermal blanket and began wrapping her neck, layering gauze and fabric together. Snow drifted silently around them. The forest held its breath. Far above, a whirring hum passed through the clouds. Leona's drone hovered over the clearing, its infrared camera capturing a bizarre tableau. One adult puma injured, one cub pressed to her side, one human kneeling in the snow beside them. Trevor's voice crackled over the comms. Is that guy helping them?" Leona stared at the live feed. "Yes," she said, half in disbelief. "And we're sure he's not the one who set the trap?" Leona zoomed in. "Look at his gear. Medical kit. Cutters. No weapons. If anything, he's the one who found her." She paused, her jaw clenched. "We need to get to that clearing, but quietly. If we spook the pumas now, they could bolt." Trevor nodded, already packing up. On the ground, Tom was lighting a small fire under the partial cover of the fallen tree, using dry twigs and his last matches. He placed the lantern near Sage's side for warmth, careful not to startle her. She opened one eye, watched him, then let it close again. "You're tougher than most things I've met," Tom said quietly. "Don't you dare quit now." He leaned back against the log, holding the thermos close to his chest. Ember lay curled at his mother's side, eyes half-lidded but still alert. The fire flickered shadows across the snowy ground, casting 3 long forms that seemed to stretch into something older than memory. Man, cat, and cub. Held together in a moment neither one had planned, but none would forget. Morning crept slowly through the pines, its light thin and cold like water spilled on steel. The storm had passed, but left behind a deep, muffling silence that hung between the trees. Icicles drooped from the low branches, catching the first gray glints of dawn. Beneath the fallen cedar where Sage lay curled, her breathing had steadied but remained shallow. Her chest rose in short, strained rhythms beneath the makeshift bandage wrapped tightly around her neck. Ember was pressed against her side, half asleep, his ears twitching with every unfamiliar sound. Tom sat nearby on a flat stone beside the dying embers of his fire, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his face drawn and weary from a sleepless night. He had checked her wound twice more since midnight, changed the gauze once, and poured what little warm broth he had left into a shallow lid for Ember. The cub had accepted it without hesitation. It wasn't much, but it kept the fire in his small body burning. Tom glanced up at the horizon. He didn't expect help, nor had he called for any. This was a place far from signal and structure, but something gnawed at his instincts. An old, lingering sense that this encounter wouldn't remain theirs alone for long. His hunch proved right. A rustle in the underbrush to the north made him rise. The sound was light, precise, not the shambling crash of a bear or the skitter of deer. He grabbed his flashlight but didn't switch it on, just stood still, eyes narrowed, heart steady. Then a voice called out, clear and clipped. "Don't move, wildlife enforcement." Tom exhaled sharply. Not a hunter, not danger, but not safety either. From behind a thick spruce stepped Dr. Leona Grant. Her gait was controlled, her boots silent on the snow. She wore a dark forest parka with a fur-lined hood and a beige tactical backpack. Her gray eyes were locked on Tom. In her right hand, not pointed but ready, was a tranquilizer pistol. "You alone?" she asked. Tom nodded slowly. "Yes." Leona scanned the scene in one long sweep. The injured puma. The cub curled against her, the cut snare lying coiled like a dead serpent in the snow. Her grip on the weapon relaxed slightly. "I saw the drone footage," she said. "Didn't believe it." Tom didn't reply. He simply stepped aside, allowing her full view of the animals. Leona approached cautiously but not without familiarity. She stopped 3 feet from Sage, kneeling. Her eyes softened as she examined the bandage. "Sterilized?" she asked. "Boiled water," Tom replied. "Bandage is cut from thermal blanket." Leona glanced at him. "Fieldwork." "Retired ranger," he said. "Tom Rivers." At the name, recognition flickered in her eyes. "I've heard of you. Weren't you the one who led the search after the snowpack collapse in Lost Fork?" "That was a long time ago," he muttered. Leona set down her bag and began unpacking equipment. Antiseptic, fresh gauze, a temperature probe, gloves. Her hands moved quickly but carefully, with the practiced precision of someone who had spent more hours with wild animals than with people. Tom watched in silence as she examined Sage's pulse and flushed the wound with saline. Sage stirred slightly under the attention but did not fight. Her eyes opened briefly, caught Leona's, then drifted shut again. "She's lucky," Leona said. "If that snare had shifted another half-inch higher, it would have crushed her airway. She has strength left." "That's something." Tom moved to Ember, crouching down to scratch behind the cub's ear. Ember, now less wary, leaned into the touch. "I didn't think I'd see one this young survive a snare incident," Leona admitted. "He didn't," Tom replied softly. "He ran to me. Found my cabin in the storm." Leona paused. She looked up. Her expression, usually stern, now cracked with something else. Respect, perhaps, or quiet awe. "I lost someone in a storm once," Tom added. "My wife, 5 years ago. I was late getting the snow tires changed, didn't make it out in time." Leona sat back, resting her elbows on her knees. Her voice was lower now. "I lost a lynx 2 winters ago. Got a call too late. When I found her, she'd chewed through her own leg to escape a bear trap. I stayed with her through the night. She died in my lap before I could sedate her. I wasn't fast enough." Tom nodded. The silence between them now had weight, but no bitterness, only understanding. After a long pause, Leona spoke again. "You didn't have to stay with them." "I couldn't leave her in pain," Tom said simply. "And yet you're not one of us. Not anymore." "I didn't know there was a them and us," he said, eyes steady. "I thought there was just right and wrong." Leona looked down. She opened her jacket and pulled out a small satellite radio. "I can call in a team, move her to a shelter, begin rehab." Tom frowned slightly. "Would she survive the stress of transport?" Leona hesitated. "It's a risk." "Then don't move her yet," Tom said. "She's not ready. Let her rest. Let her heal." Leona stared at him. Then, slowly, she put the radio back in her pocket. "You want to monitor her here?" "I'll build a windbreak. Keep the fire going. Check the wound every 4 hours. You can send your team back tomorrow." Leona studied him for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "I'll be back by nightfall," she said. "Don't let the fire die." As she stood and turned, Tom called after her. "You trust me?" Leona paused, her back still turned. "No, but she does," she said, nodding toward Sage, "and that's more than I usually need." She disappeared into the trees, her boots vanishing into fresh snow. Tom stood alone again, beside the fire, beside the sleeping mother and her watchful cub. A fragile alliance had formed, not just between him and the animals, but between 2 wounded people stitched together by silence, pain, and the shared act of mercy. The wind had returned, but this time it whispered, not howled. The third day arrived with a hush so complete even the trees seemed to hold their breath. The storm had passed, the skies had cleared to a soft, pale blue, and the wind had stilled. Sunlight filtered weakly through the branches of the bitterroot forest, dappling the snow-covered ground with golden streaks. The clearing where Sage had once lain broken and bleeding was now quiet, but no longer desperate. There, beneath the weathered canopy of a downed cedar, she stood. Sage moved with care, but no longer with pain. Her breathing had deepened. The rise and fall of her ribcage no longer strained. The wound around her neck, though still raw and tender, had closed enough to no longer seep blood. She had accepted the bandages. She had allowed Tom near. And now she was preparing to leave. Tom stood a few feet away, leaning on a walking stick fashioned from a branch the night before. His back was sore, but his face was calm. He had cleaned the bandages that morning, and when Sage had stood without trembling, he had known. She was ready. Ember had grown bolder in those 3 days. The cub now walked in wide circles around the clearing, tail high, leaping onto low logs and chasing after drifting pine needles. His coat had dried and fluffed, and his legs, once clumsy, had grown steadier. But now, sensing the shift in his mother, he returned to her side and pressed his head against her shoulder. Sage turned toward Tom. Their eyes met, hers pale green, his weathered blue. There was no noise, no warning, no flare of drama. Just a look, not quite gratitude, not quite farewell, but something in between. A recognition. A bond. Then, without ceremony, she turned and began to walk. Ember followed her, his paws soft against the snow, glancing once over his shoulder. As they reached the edge of the trees, Ember paused. He turned back, trotted toward Tom, and nudged his head gently into the man's thigh. Tom smiled but didn't move. Ember stepped back, blinked once, and then disappeared into the trees after his mother. Tom stood alone in the clearing for a long time, the only sound now the soft crackle of the fire behind him. He did not try to follow. He did not call out. He simply watched the space where they had vanished. Behind him, snow crunched softly. Leona Grant approached, a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder, her gray eyes alert beneath the shadow of her hood. Her movements were slower today. Less mission, more presence. "They left?" she asked. Tom nodded. Leona lowered the bag beside the fire and crouched down. "How's her wound?" "Closed," Tom said. "Still tender, but no sign of infection." "Good work," she said, then paused. "You didn't try to stop them?" "No," Tom replied. "They're not mine to keep." Leona gave a quiet nod of agreement. After a few moments, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded document. Laminated, stamped with the emblem of the Montana Wildlife Corridor Initiative. "We're setting up a field station at Elk Hollow," she said, "closer to the ridge where you found her. They're trying to expand the conservation buffer into private land. There's talk of a long-term observational program. Non-invasive, remote cams, tracking scat, prints, behavioral patterns." She extended the document toward Tom. "We could use someone who knows these mountains like you do." Tom didn't take the paper right away. He stared into the fire. Then he finally said, "I haven't worked with people in a long time." "Most of us out here haven't," Leona replied, "but maybe that's why it works." Tom took the paper and folded it into his coat. "I'll think about it." She smiled faintly. "That's all I came to ask." That night, Tom sat by the fire again, alone now. The logs cracked and hissed, sending soft embers drifting into the black. He opened the old, leather-bound notebook that had remained untouched since Marjorie's passing. The pages were yellowed, some curled by time. He uncapped a pen and wrote on a fresh page. "They are not meant to be tamed. They are meant to be understood and protected." He closed the notebook and set it beside him. Months passed. Winter ebbed slowly into spring. The snow began to soften, then disappear, replaced by wet earth and early crocus blooms. Life returned to the forest in trickles. Migratory birds, curious foxes, insects stirring beneath bark. Tom remained in the cabin, now occasionally visited by Leona or a young field volunteer bringing supplies. He had accepted the offer. Not as a researcher, not exactly. More as a guardian of sorts. A steward. One evening, just before dusk, Tom stepped out of his cabin with a slab of frozen venison wrapped in wax paper. He laid it carefully on the flat rock just beyond the tree line, the same spot where he had once left food in the depth of winter. Then he returned to his chair by the fire, letting the last light spill through the cabin windows. And from the ridge, half hidden in shadow and trees, something watched. Ember, now nearly grown, stood tall and strong beside a thicket of young birch. His coat had darkened to match his mother's, though his eyes were still wide with curiosity. He stared down at the cabin with a gaze neither fearful nor tame. A pause. A memory. Then he turned back toward the woods and disappeared. Sometimes the wildest hearts are the ones that teach us the gentlest truths. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from cages or control, but from patience, trust, and simply choosing to care. In our own lives, there are moments when we're called to act, not with force, but with quiet compassion. If this story touched something in you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs hope today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what this story meant to you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor the silent bonds between humans and animals. Thank you for watching and spending your time with us. We'll see you in the next story.